Hello, welcome to the first episode of Words Over Water. I'm Todd Spire. Our guest today is going to be Jesse Vadala, I'd like to do a little bit of an intro. Jesse and I have been friends for years, about I don't know, maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, we started sort of doing a weekly call with each other. One of the purposes of that was to create accountability to people that are sort of out in the world, and trying to educate people and trying to be good conservationists and anglers at the same time. And really, what started as just information sharing about things that are happening across the region regarding watershed conservation became an even deeper friendship, and one that ultimately led to sort of what we're here to do tonight, which is to talk about the watershed together, in sort of an audience format and a podcast format. This was something that was a very long time in the making for me. As I'd always wanted, Jesse was the one who pushed me over the line. And here we are, starting the first episode. So I couldn't be happier to have Jesse here with us today. I have to look over to my notes because I always mess it up. Jesse is the Trout Unlimited Northeast Engagement Coordinator. Okay, his work with Trout Unlimited, he is, ladies and gentlemen, one of the few people who are paid for Trout Unlimited. He has a very coveted job in our world, and a very important one because he's helping to manage streamside projects and watershed management projects across the region, in primarily New York. But I believe you dip your toe in a couple of other states at times. And, to sort of jump back and right into what brought tonight to be is that, in lieu of everything that's happening with the Esopus Creek right now, from turbidity to flows, et cetera, which we're going to dig into tonight, the impetus for Trout Unlimited to start taking everything it's been learning for the last however many years in the projects that they've been conducting in the Western Catskills. I hear this sentiment echoed by a lot of people, which is that it's that the Eastern Catskills is getting a little bit of a bad rap, and there's a whole lot of reasons for that. Some of it we'll touch on tonight, but it's very politically charged as far as water management over here. So watershed conservation often takes a back seat. It's one of the things I always say about Trout Unlimited in the Eastern Catskills, the Catskill Mountain chapter, the Mid-Hudson chapter, to an extent, the Ashokan-Papacton chapter, right? The model of Trout Unlimited breaks down here a little bit in that, normally Trout Unlimited is welcome to come in and do watershed projects, whereas because of the stakeholders that are here, we don't often get to do that. So Jesse's one of those people that gets to do that, because Trout Unlimited gets to engage in projects here that not everybody can just sort of like pull up their bootstraps and engage in. So it's my absolute pleasure to talk about the state of the Esopus tonight with Jesse Vadala.
Thank you, Todd. Much appreciated.
Yeah.
I think, as you mentioned, this is a long time coming. We've had this conversation of what it takes to put the opportunity at play, to have a great care and a passion for a river. And those of you who know Todd before tonight's discussion know that, not just for the last few years, but for many years now, Todd's been helping to advocate for the Esopus in a way that is unique to himself. I am someone who got into the world of fishing and fly fishing by a lot of reading and a lot of exploration of rivers. And walking out of the Esopus one day, I found my way to the Esopus Creel shop. Todd and my friendship gained quite a lot from that time. But a big piece, I think, of what draws us back together is that when folks get worried about rivers, we're interested in what's the right move to make that worry something worthwhile. So a topic like tonight, talking about the Esopus in a tough time, isn't sensationalism. It isn't driving people into the room to say that the river's in peril. It's just the opposite. It's to bring us into a conversation that says this is a river to celebrate. It's incredible. It's a truly remarkable fishery. So the idea that we would talk about the state of the Esopus now, even on the heels of a tough season, is really just speaking to the incredible nature of this river. And there's folks that are on the call tonight who have been fishing it for longer than I've been around as well. And I just think it's just testament to how wonderful the river is. So, and to Todd's point, my work at TU has largely been focused in the last few years in the Catskills, but heavily on the western side, on the west branch of the Delaware and the east branch of the Delaware and all of its tributaries. So much of our work at TU is about connectivity, and we're going to get into some of that as well today too. But I really want to learn what's the best that we can do to help be a support system for the Esopus and for the eastern side of the Catskills. As Todd mentioned, it's complex, but it's so beautiful and so worth it. So I'm excited to get to learn more about the river, and I have spent a lot of time doing this kind of research, studying on what it takes to make rivers like this succeed and what it takes to have the miracle of wild trout in them. So yeah, I'm excited to get to talk today. Thank you, Todd, for putting this together. And yeah, it's gonna be a great chat.
Yeah, thank you too. And it's what's interesting. Start like there's like the good news, bad news thing, right? So like the conditions on the Esopus are pretty abysmal right now. But I want to start with the punchline because it's really important for people to realize two things. One, everything's going to be perfectly fine, right? So what's really interesting, you put this out and you say, oh, we're going to talk about the state of the Esopus. And a few people are like, oh, I can't make it tonight, but like, just please tell me the Esopus is going to be okay. And it's absolutely going to be fine. I know this from history, and what we're going to delve into is some of those reasons about why we know it's going to be fine. But one of the points that I want to make right off the bat too is that the Esopus, as you just said, is a really unique fishery, right? It's got a lot of things that are going for it. It's going to be around for a long time. It has a lot of antidotes to global warming, like one of the highest rainfalls in the state of New York up at the headwaters. We have the infusion, the pseudo tailwater that we get from the Schoharie. It's besides the turbidity, right? It's going to stay cooler for a longer period of time than a lot of the freestone rivers. That said, this is an opportunity. It's hard to educate when everything's fine. And, it's really interesting because somebody said to me recently, like, oh, you're always upset about the river, and it's not that I'm upset. It's just that when things go wrong, it gives us a great opportunity to educate people. And that's also like, I think why we're here too, because, part of this came from this perspective of like, wow, is it time to like raise a concern with the stakeholders, at the city and state level? And that's actually what prompted this conversation tonight, really, for things that you were hearing.
Absolutely. Yeah. I to your point, there has been a lot of concern. Folks have reached out to me directly. I've seen it as well. Anytime you see a river running red, it's easy to think that we are at some sort of, foul play level. But I think that's what we're learning a lot about the system, and that we'll talk about today, the complexities of the reservoir itself and its turbidity, the clay basin, but also to the real impacts of climate change and the drought that we experience that needs to be drawn into that category and that one alone. That's what we're fighting the biggest battle with, is climate change. So.
Do you want to talk to give people that might not know, what's happening, like just a quick overview of like what are the extreme conditions that we're experiencing right now on the Esopus?
Yeah, so at this time, we've got an extremely drawn down reservoir system that we rely on, specifically for this cold flow to come out through the portal in Shandaken. As you've seen, if you keep an eye on the DEP reservoir levels, they are extremely low. We've had to draw down quite a lot of water. I say we, as in DEP has drawn quite a lot of water through the system, leaving the reservoirs at a safe but low level. The massive drought coinciding with repairs to the aqueduct system made for a tremendous challenge. So I think what we're seeing today is a river running from a very low reservoir system, but it tells us an awful lot about how necessary it is to put water down into the Ashokan and to take care of the fish within the reservoir system, which I think we're going to get into pretty deep on. But.
Right. Yeah, and what we're getting to at the because now that the Schoharie is being exhausted, right? So why is the Esopus sort of more red than you've ever seen it before? Is because the Schoharie is now below 5%. It might even be below 4% now.
4.8 last I checked.
Yeah. So what we're getting is literally the dregs at the bottom of the Schoharie. Right. So imagine the Schoharie is what, 70 million gallons, right?
17 billion.
17 billion. Sorry,
17 million. Sorry.
17 billion.
Not billion. There's an M there. 17 million. Yeah.
Literally the dregs at the bottom of the reservoir. The entire, and again, just making sure, because there are going to be people on this call that don't really know, right? The Eastern Catskills is geologically has a lot of clay wrapped up in all of the sediment that dropped out of what was dragged down in the last ice age. And as the natural process of erosion happens, the banks widen and clay is exposed, and then it runs into the rivers. The watershed to the north of us, the Schoharie watershed, has a lot of clay in it, and that clay starts to deposit itself into the Schoharie and then eventually through the portal and make its way down to the Ashokan. So that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing all that collected clay make its way down and through and out. I think it's important though to back up for a second and also sort of talk about, right, what started as a drawdown for safety concerns. And now I'm talking regionally. That's what I mean. I want to back up and talk about it regionally for a second. And you might be able to talk more about this on the western side, right? What was initially a drawdown for safety has become, because we never got rain, right? They just needed to keep grabbing water, right?
Yeah.
So it was just supposed to be to reach safe levels. And then it was out of sort of a dire need, right?
Yeah.
The city consumes 1 billion gallons of water a day. Right now, it's just a little bit below that of daily consumption, which is great. I've seen it as high as 1.1, 1.3 sometimes in my time. And now it's pretty consistently just below a billion. But it's important to realize that there are only 60 days worth of water downstate in the reservoirs down there. This whole shutdown of the western side was really dependent on rain. It needed to be raining, and it hasn't been raining. And so again, that drawdown that was coming out of the Schoharie started as safety and then became like they direly needed the water to go south.
Yeah, yeah, and especially as the city, as city voices and authorities kind of demanded more drought-like conditions, the drawdown or the amount of available water coming out of systems, even famously running well at this time, like the West Branch, would continue to see lower managed flows due to these extreme drought conditions. They will not be able to move large volumes of water for fear of keeping that reservoir at a good capacity. So what we've experienced now is kind of the unfortunate perfect storm in so many ways. Because the shutdown of the work has stopped at this point, flows are being managed at a very low volume. They will likely stay this low, if not lower, on the West Branch of the Delaware. So what we have are very, very low stream conditions in most cases, and there is fear on many folks that there's detriment that's being caused by such low flows. However, it is not outside of the FFMP, which is the management system that helps control what happens on the West Branch of the Delaware. It's also what has made great protections for the trout of the Delaware. And it's something that I think we aspire to when we talk about management of the Esopus, is something that has a high and low field that you can stay within that gives some predictability. The real challenge on the West Branch of the Delaware for anglers who've been fishing it is that we got no word that they were going to drop into an extremely low management plan. When it was decided by New York City that we were in a drought warning condition and that the aqueduct repair was stopping, there was not the heads up that they would be dropping into the lowest table of management from 500 CFS to 65. That was not something that was forecasted, and typically it can be. So we were a part of a big advocacy campaign on folks just being mindful of the conditions on the river, considering how low. So,
yeah. And while we're on it, there was a positive benefit on the East Branch during the initial drawdown. Again, on the west side, it was all safety, right? Drawing it down, drawing the reservoirs down enough so that if they started to fill with the expected rain, that we wouldn't have flooding. Basically, that's the basic premise of the initial drawdown, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what
anticipating a wet fall, and we didn't get it.
Yeah. We didn't get it. But what was the benefit to the East Branch this season during that drawdown?
Tell me where you're going with this. I think you're prompting me to answer, but I think you know this.
Well, the fishing was amazing, right? So it's sort of interesting. We had this on the Esopus. I forget now. I'm forgetting like what the cause was, but all of a sudden, like you're forced into some sort of like water transfer protocol, and you get this benefit of having this like unbelievably incredible fishery. And so the East Branch wound up being incredible when they're usually starting to like tighten up the purse strings of water. They were drawing down on the Pepacton, and the East Branch became this unbelievable fall fishery.
Okay, you broke the rules. That's why I didn't have the answer. You spoke about the East Branch and how good the fishing is, and I'm pretty sure by Catskill rules you're supposed to say the branch, and you didn't, so I didn't know. Sorry, but yeah, the fishing was fantastic on the East Branch this year, and that was a result of the water moving around a lot differently during the repair system.
Yeah, I got to make a note. I'm not aware of protocols for
Yeah,
disclosing
the shush
Delaware.
branch, as they call it. Dave
There's
Brandt
nothing
used to
with
say.
the home.
Yeah, he used to call it
Yeah.
that.
Um,
Cool.
yeah, for sure. So back to the Esopus, right? And just sort of like we wanted to start with this like data overview. We need 1 million gallons of water down in the city. They can only store 60 days down there. And here's the kicker. It takes 20 days of the Catskill Aqueduct. Right now, this is the pipe again going from the the Ashokan downstate. It takes 20 days full bore to deliver 1 day of water to the city. And so in lieu of the shutdown that was happening, and if you don't realize, again, I just want to make sure for anybody that, might be new to the audience, right? Um, there were a lot of fractures in the Delaware Aqueduct, which normally supplies the city with 60% of its water. They were losing about 35 million gallons a day was the estimate. And so they built a bypass tunnel where the tunnel had started to collapse. It turned out that they drilled some of the tunnel through a little more limestone-based geology than they had hoped for. It started to collapse. So they built a bypass tunnel and it was time to hook it up. So that's why the western part is closed. They're relying on our aqueduct, the Catskill Aqueduct, which normally delivers 40%, to deliver 100% of that water. And like I said, it's a losing battle because they can, you're always at a net loss from day to day. It had to rain or this was never going to work. The Delaware
Hmm.
Aqueduct, though, can deliver about 1 billion gallons a day. If I'm reading, I was going back and reading that at full bore. So it's pretty amazing. It's really quite amazing. And again, they had postponed this shutdown. The bypass tunnel had completed about 3 years ago. Is it
Hmm.
so
They
about,
started the warnings 3 years ago. Yeah.
yeah, so that was 2 years that they postponed because the modeling that DEP was seeing, the weather modeling, was not predicting enough rain. And so this was the year. This was going to be the wet year, right?
It was going to happen. Yeah.
It's going to happen.
Sadly, no. And I don't know if that means that there was partial repair work done, some degree of patching that reduces the amount. I haven't read any statements, maybe you have, that say a report on the work that was done during this operational period. Because as again, we're talking about fractures to the system. So there could have been some really good positives completed. I'm not clear on them at the moment, but I
Yeah,
hope to hear more.
I don't have information on that. I'm also curious if you know
Yeah.
anything about the amount of time that they're anticipating it'll take to get the Delaware Aqueduct back online. Do you know about that?
That I don't know. I should ask Jeff. I'm not positive on that. If they've mentioned when or how soon, not sure.
Yeah,
I'll
and
find out.
Jesse talking about Jeff Skelding of FUDR, Friends of the Upper Delaware River, which
Yeah.
is a watershed organization on the western side of the Catskills that has a really fantastic amount of transparency in their communications with the city and state and how they're going to be managing flows for the Delaware Aqueduct. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well said.
absolutely. So, you know, I think this is also a good point to mention that, I don't really see any point in placing blame on the DEP for getting it wrong, right? Like this was all predicated on Mother Nature's involvement. And I think it's really important that, and I mean, this is my opinion, and people can differ, and then we're always going to have differing opinions, but there's really nothing that DEP could have done, right? They have sophisticated modeling. They boast the most sophisticated weather modeling on the planet, whether it is or it isn't. Like they absolutely are doing their best. The modeling was doing its best. They were basing their decisions on weather modeling, and it just didn't happen, right? So this isn't a failure on the part of anybody, right? It's really just like, what's the best move going forward? And I think that's important. And the decisions to draw the Schoharie down as far as they have, and we'll get to that in a minute. Part of the purpose of having this conversation is to really just talk about all of the implications of what's happening, right? Not necessarily the good and the bad or the right and the wrong, right? I don't think this is something to go to war over because I have faith in the fishery that transcends the alarming nature of what I see and the kind of common sense, the knee-jerk reaction that you want to have. I have faith based on what I've observed over the years that the fishery will be fine, right? And I think that's a really important point too, right? The back to the weather aspect. the rainfall versus snowfall. And I'm curious if you might have any insight on that. We talk about the sources of water here. And one of the
Mhm.
things that's trended over time, and I'm sure Trout Unlimited has looked at it, so I'll bounce this back to you, is like we used to rely on snowmelt predominantly for a certain volume of water in our systems. And through the impacts of global warming, we're now relying more on just rainfall than the snow melt, um, which I'm sure probably impacts the projects that you're doing as well. Do you have insight on that or thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do think obviously the it all counts as positive on the watershed side isn't totally that clear. Obviously, when we have snowfall, we've got continual additional sediment carrying along with melted snow that it doesn't quite happen as naturally over rainfall. But obviously, and this is kind of what we mentioned earlier, is that many of our tributaries in the Catskill systems, including the Esopus, the tributaries themselves have been stripped bare of trees, and so impacts of weather are real, and they impact the stream very quickly because there's not more of a buffer there. The ultimate health of a river, when we talk about it from a much larger scale, is about stability of habitat. And ways that systems create ways to absorb water and give it to the resources naturally, which happens on undeveloped streams in so many ways. When you look at a piece of woods like the Upper Willow Weemont, headwaters of the Willow, you'll see water and how it's absorbed into a system so naturally. There's dense hemlock forest that's never been adjusted or adapted or ruined in any way. And so water makes its way into the stream at a very natural and slow seeping pace, which cannot happen because of the elevation of tributaries in the Esopus system and, as part of it. But in general, with such massive degradation to the riparian buffers of streams, it's not a surprise that snowfall or rainfall on a system like the Esopus has dark impacts very quickly. So I think that's to be said. I don't know that 100% that it checks back to our work as cleanly, but I do think it is a major source of it, is that as these systems, small streams, little tiny tributaries like Stony Clove, and others that feed the Esopus are it's really important, obviously, that the connectivity is there, and we'll get into that too. But I think that when it comes to rainfall and where it goes and what a system can do, culverts, road passages, bridges, they all become really important factors because they are constrictors to that flow.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Does the oh, I just lost the question I was going to ask you. I was at, oh, that's right. I'm sort of curious if you could speak generally about what types of projects does Trout Unlimited usually engage in, right? Like riparian buffer zone or like culvert replacement, or like is there a trend of what gets the money, that gets the attention, that gets the time?
Yeah, there is. I think in New York State specifically, the native brook trout, eastern brook trout in general, help us find a framework for what we do. And the tributaries, the headwater streams, that's where the brook trout are, the stronghold populations of brook trout in New York State, the ones that we're so desperate to try and gain a strong understanding on. We know that they need connectivity, number one. So if there was a hot button that got projects happening, it's not so much just restoration, rebuilding streams, but it's largely about connection. It's tributaries, and culvert replacements are a huge piece of it. Additionally, when we're thinking about structures that are maybe undersized for the water needs, we're also thinking these are opportunities to reintroduce riparian buffers, zones that gain more wood. And that was traditionally tree plantings that occurred on stream side buffers. Again, that term riparian is used often. It's really speaking to the immediate action zone around a creek or a stream, or a bigger river. But in addition to planting trees on the banks, what we do on a lot of our work at TU for culvert replacements or for restoration work is we're installing large wood as a way to reintroduce organic buffers, organic materials that help filter food, water, and sediment. They create shade and structure for fish that don't exist, again, on streams that have been ripped from massive industrialization. Our streams are bare of hardwood. So the work we do is largely about making sure fish have ultimate passage from headwaters to the main stems of streams and rivers. And then also just adding wood as often as possible. We frequently keep it simple and say wood is good, but on brook trout streams and wild trout streams in general, the determining factor of how strong food sources, macroinvertebrates are, habitat that trout can live in, it's dependent on wood. And streams with healthy riparian zones, whether by natural tree growth or by reintroduction like methods of these, that's a big piece of what we do at TU. It's reconnecting quality habitat while watching the stability of a stream from a very large scale. So looking at the small trickling headwaters section of a river, but also the large raging 45-foot wide section of the river down below. Those needs are different, but a holistic view helps us understand exactly what will keep that tributary flowing into the large stem. And then bringing it back to the Esopus, as you have said, and I've borrowed your phrase on this, but the Shangri-La effect of the tributaries of the Esopus, they are the spawning tributaries. They hold so much value, and the connectivity in the Catskills is huge. So I'm thankful that our work at TU has been able to stretch across more of the Catskills in the last year. I helped support DEC on the West Kill, where we were doing more stabilization, and we've done recent culvert replacements there as well. So the work is starting to make its way over east, and I'm looking forward to it. And more replacements on the Batavia Kill, the East Branch side of the Batavia Kill, and a lot more to be done. So yeah, it's when we talk about the hot stuff that's working for TU at a national level and locally in New York, it's largely about connectivity at the first item.
Yeah, there's like a whole bunch of questions, but thank you for that. Because I'm curious. I'll ask you about those sort of offline, I think, because it's interesting. It's not the answer I would expect it, but of course, now it makes perfect sense that it's about connectivity.
Yeah.
I want to like point out something you brought up because you started there and then you returned to it. This idea of the speed at which water is reintroduced into the system, right? Very, very important aspect of why the Esopus is as resilient as it is. Its headwaters are very slow releasing, right? So they get a ton of water and they don't spit it right out, right? Which is pretty amazing, especially given the elevation that change that you have there, right? But still relatively slow releasing headwaters, which are really vital when it comes to the deep, hot summer, the on the Esopus, right? So that's really important. A counterpoint to that, the Schoharie, a lot of exposed bedrock, and that means that water is going to move its way downstream much faster. Even on the Esopus, Birch Creek is another counterpoint. Birch Creek does not hold its water as long as most places. The water there is historically always very low. I only fish Birch Creek when it's raining. I've never fished Birch Creek. I literally go in the rain. It's one of the places I go,
Yeah.
right? Because those fish are just so hard to catch in normal flow because they're dug in. I mean, they're there, not to burn a spot or whatever, but it's, it's one of the major tributaries. And, but it's not a place to go fish on any given day. But the headwaters of the river are very important. And I'll say too that the area just above the portal then, like in the deepest part of the summer, right? So you've got cold headwaters that are releasing, make their way downstream, right? Those waters have traveled the longest distance, which means they've had the longest amount of time to warm up before they meet with the influx of the portal. So from like a riparian buffer zone standpoint, and I'll highlight this, right? That sort of like Fox Hollow, Peck area. That's one of the places that I would probably point to immediately on the main stem that should get the most amount of attention from a buffer zone standpoint, from potentially rechannelizing, right? Because once you hit that,
love to see it.
That's a pretty important. The stretch basically from Route 28 going north, pretty hammered, right? Like really hard, but it's still narrow. And once it really starts to widen as it comes through, like where the Wayside Lodge is, that's an area I think that, because you start to lose tree cover.
Oh yeah. Yeah. You mentioned Fox Hollow, just up from Fox Hollow and that DEP parcel there. There's so that erosion on the banks there is so scary. It has to be rapid dropping trees. Season after season, when you go there, you notice how much dramatic change has happened in that area. The upper Esopus specifically, and not any of this again to point fingers. This is to say that because of elevation and because of large amounts of sediment it is going to roll through and rip open an open bank. But when we talk about reinstalling healthy riparian buffers, folks like the Ashokan Stream Management Plan and Cornell and others that have been active to support the tributaries have said the same things. That this is where we can take action. We can't do a lot more to restore other sections of the Esopus for obvious reasons, which we talked about, but we can work on other sections, upper and tributaries, which I hope to see more of.
Do you guys, I mean, it's funny, like I just talked about like a wish list, but does Trout Unlimited have an idea of areas that it wants to look at specifically yet in the Eastern Catskills?
In terms of the Eastern Catskills, and a lot of the credit I'll give to Steve Swenson at DEC, who we partner with directly. He's local to our area. He cares very deeply about the Catskill systems. Westkill is like his real baby. So he spent a lot of time there the last few years working on that stream. And we've talked about the upper Esopus as well. Working with cohesively partnering with DEC, I think helps a lot to think about strategies in that way. So the work we're doing at TU is very much hand in glove with DEC for any types of available permits to work on projects like these. So really we have to kind of start with assessment and then think about what a long-term goal might be. And I don't think that we're at a point where we're intimidated by DEP ownership on land, as from a TU perspective. Just the opposite. It seems like we know enough about the protocols or what are needed in order to establish healthy riparian improvements. And when there's opportunities to not have a larger impact on the stream by bringing in equipment and creating better structure for filtration and for slowing down sediment, I think we will. I think you'll see it happen on the Esopus, on the upper Esopus. I think you will see it. I'm speaking that just positively on the gain we've made across the Catskills in the last 3 years, not because I have like a foretold knowledge of where on the upper Esopus we'd work, but we start all this work the same way. And I think the cool part for folks who are on this call is that everything is data driven. It's all about collecting information on a watershed. Thankfully, the Esopus has been studied for so long for wild fish, for really tremendous depth of knowledge. A lot of great things about the Esopus, tons of public fishing rights and lots of data. It's been studied for wild fish for a long time. So I think that the proof of why our work is necessary in the upper Esopus is clear. We have the ability to help impact and support a system that's dealing with heavy sediment loads in the Catskills. We've been doing it well. So I think we'll continue to try and bring those strategies over to our side. And right now, I mean, I think of our main role is helping support folks like the Catskill Mountains chapter, the Ashokan Compacton chapter, who have been really heavily stewarding the river for many years. I always want to make sure they feel supported and they bring on new active stewards like some folks who are on this call. But also, I think there is a real possibility that we'll be talking about TU work to help improve the upper Esopus in the future.
And follow-up question on that is, your work is likely going to be in smaller areas, it's size-wise, right? On tributaries, smaller stretches, width-wise of the river. Is that correct?
Correct. Yep. Yeah, I think we have the strongest impacts there. Folks that I really look up to who have helped kind of shape my understanding of rivers and what we do. Ed Van Putt is quite literally the person who wrote the book on trout fishing in the Catskills, right? But his knowledge goes far, far beyond that. When I sat down to talk to Ed, and most of you know who Ed is, but for those who don't, again, beyond writing about the Catskills, he worked for DEC for 30 plus years, established all the public fishing rights that we all love on the Willowemoc and the Beaver Kill, a lot of the Esopus as well, Ed was involved in. So when I talked to Ed about what could people do, hey, we all care about a river, what would I do? I just work at TU, or I just know a bunch of TU volunteers, what can we do? When I asked Ed that at Summerfest at the museum a couple of years ago, he said tributaries being open is the thing that people could do. People could be a part of manually checking on local tributaries, streams to their rivers that they love, and looking for impairments, looking for things that look out of place, big, large settlements of rock and stone and wood that might have settled into a junction underneath a bridge that wasn't there last season. If possible, identifying those things and then getting them opened up has a real impact. Ed was telling me how they used to do it with crowbars and chainsaws on Bennett Brook, a tributary of the Beaver Kill. And he could see fish swimming past his boots in late October while they were opening up the tributary. So I think that's the kind of vision I think about for the small water when it comes to TU and how we could potentially help in the Esopus system, is that by helping build community like this, where people say, no, it's my job. I drive by Fox Hollow every day. I'm going to go look and make sure that it's not jammed up under the bridge. And if it is, I'm just going to call DEC, and I'll call Ed Rowley or one of the other DEC fisheries tech and say, hey, I think this tributary is jammed up. Is there anything we can do? That's
Yeah.
the kind of thing that I think was really happening in Ed's time. And I think he helped bring a lot of people into that idea. I hope to be a part of that too, that says you are responsible too. You have a choice. Go take a look before spawning season.
We keep going down some rabbit holes, and that's fine because ultimately tonight, and I know a lot of people are on the call now. So you guys are getting witness to our production process of sort of making this podcast. So I don't mind going off these holes because I'm going to edit it back into something sort of potentially a little bit more cohesive. But so this is one of the questions I said, I've got a couple of curveballs, and so I'm going to want your opinion cold, and I'm not going to use any names on this. So
okay.
been doing the red survey with Catskill Mountain chapter, and went back to a spot that I keep going to. It's up in the headwaters, not too far up, but it's up. And go with my son, Sydney, every year. And so we came across a beaver dam, two beaver dams, one upstream and one downstream of its house. And the upstream one was pretty serious. It was about 4+ feet deep, probably about waist high. Fish passage completely blocked above and below. And, sent the flag up and sent around some photos and the whole thing. And the state's position was that they didn't see any need to intervene. And here's what's interesting, right? And this is where it's like debatable, right? Because we all have different opinions. The reason being is that the location was right around the place that they had found that the browns are trickling out and the brook trout start to come in, right? So it's right on that. And I know that this is something that Trout Unlimited has been studying. I believe that was part of your study on the Willowweemuck, not this summer, but last summer, maybe continued this summer. And so this is a really massive dam. I think the upstream side will probably survive for a while. The downstream side might blow out a little bit, but still, just around the bend, the first large pool below this beaver dam, what do you think I saw? A lot of trout, a lot of trout. And they were young, but they were spawning age. These weren't giant trout, but these were young. I won't say anything beyond that. But I would say 40 to 50 3-year-old trout. First year spawners.
Mostly brown trout or brook trout at that point too?
In a branch of the.
Got it. Okay, I understand the information. Yeah.
So but let's talk about this for a second. So we hadn't talked about it, so it'll be fresh, right? So people, there's two sides to this, right? Impeding fish passage of the browns into an area that we want to protect, where we know that there are brook trout. But then there's the fact that the trout need to spawn. And in low water that we have in the drought, there's nowhere for them to do it. So where do you go, right? Do you bust it open? Or is the benefit of keeping these two species a little bit more separate outweigh the need for space to spawn? And that's literally, I think, what it comes down to. So what's your hip check on hearing that?
100%. I love the topic too. And one of my colleagues, Kyle Glenn, who works out in Buffalo, he's been studying headwater streams, specifically beaver activity related to brook trout in the South Moose. So if you're familiar with the Adirondacks, where Old Forge is, the inlet area as we're heading into the western side of the big, deep Adirondack woods. The South Moose Plains is a big, huge, complex wetland system full of brook trout. It's also full of beavers. There's beaver dams of all sizes and shapes all over that system, but it's flush with brook trout. And a lot of what we're finding on streams and rivers from Western New York across is that beaver dams, specifically near headwaters, are often creating an ability to slowly move big deposits of cold water. And you alluded to this earlier, talking about the upper section of the Esopus and how it slowly gives its water out. Those beaver dams really do that at a large scale, and they create depth for habitat that is a higher value, I think, than a negative, right? So I think that more often than not, the general idea is that beaver dams will create such a high level of increase for depth and for habitat for trout that the removal of them, especially close to the headwaters of the stream, seems complex enough to not want to move it. The wood, as we know, has its big value. I just talked about that part. But I really think when it comes to headwater streams where there's beaver activity, what we might be finding is that there's Beaver Dam A here and Beaver Dam B here. And what this is doing now is creating a longer expanse of cold water. So that cold water is now seeping down in, reaching into soft soil underneath, and it's continuing to lower the temperature grade down below. So my thought would be the number one thing we would do from a TU perspective is temperature monitoring above and below the dams. That really tells us a lot about what's happening. Burying some temperature loggers deep in and letting it run all through the summer up and down a watershed. As you mentioned, the Willowwemoc, that was 100% the goal. We wanted to study temperature at the worst time of the season. How bad does it really get in the Willowwemoc? On the upside, the Willowwemoc's beautiful. It doesn't really get all that hot. It's great. And it's full of wild trout for that reason. We studied it all the way down through the main stem in town. We did find 1 or 2 point sources where there's warmer water. We want to work on that. But for the most part, a stream like the Willowwemoc has, incredibly dense, rich habitat at the headwaters. The Esopus is no different. I think beaver activity, I think wood, we're going to learn more about. We're studying it from a temperature basis and then also going back in with DEC and doing electroshock surveys around these reaches to better understand how many fish and in what capacity are holding in and around those pools.
Yeah. Do we have any insight about what is the threshold? Like you talked about studying temperature, but I know that some studies are being done here in my neck of the woods on the upper stretches of the Westkill too. And it's a concern of it's so beautifully a concern that's embodied by all of the streamside landowners through the Westkill Valley too.
Yeah.
This concern about the browns making their way up into the brook trout. Now, to be clear, the brown population that's here is 100% stocked, very, very few, right? So having stocked trout make their way further upstream into that native brook trout territory is very, very, potentially very, very bad. On the Esopus, it's a little bit different. There's a lot more space for one, but also you now have, you've got some older strain browns that have been around for a long time. And, I don't really have a thought so much as that, you've now got wild trout pushing up against wild trout that are coming out of different species. But sorry, back to the question. Do we have any indication that we know what is the trigger for where that line happens? Because I believe that's one of the things we're trying to study. Why is there such a definitive break? Because we see this over and over again. Browns go up and then all of a sudden it's like boom, and there's a line.
And then they go back. Yeah.
You don't have a lot of crossover. So that's really the question. Do we know what causes that line yet?
I love that question. And I'll say that it exists on multiple watersheds. I don't know that there's a finite answer. Ed Van Putt is one of those. Again, I'll mention the Willowwemoc because we've talked about it specifically there, where that's the exact same occurrence. You have almost an invisible line, but all introduced fish in the willow just seem to disappear after a certain point. The habitat itself is what tells us what fish are there. And in studying it, we're able to see that, again, these maybe smaller, more shallow sections of the stream and river are not prime habitat for the brown trout versus the brook trout. Regardless of whether they're a hatchery brown trout or a wild brown trout, I think that larger mature fish are seeking out different habitat than our brook trout. And so we are seeing them see a certain line, a change in the habitat, whether that's temperature driven or conditional beyond temperature, and they're heading back downriver. So it's continued to be a part of the studies on many streams where wild native fish or native fish and wild fish exist up high. In Connecticut, there's some pretty cool practice there where they have streams that have dams or impairments naturally, and they've started studying brook trout up above and taking all the brown trout and removing them from the upper sections and putting them down below barriers. It's happening all over the state of Connecticut. We hope to do more of it next year, using natural barriers to help separate fish for the increased habitat of native brook trout. That's a little bit forward for some folks, I think, the idea, but we're I say we, working with state conservation deep in Connecticut, DEC, and New York. They're electroshocking these fish anyway. If the concept is taking brown trout, moving them down below a big barrier where they continue to thrive and do great for the angler and themselves, it's a win for everybody. And the brook trout get less pressure, so they do well. I'd love to see something like that happen in our system. So when it comes to that challenge, that's what I think. It's like, oh man, where's the first barrier we could get all those brown trout down below? That'd be good for the that'd be good for all of it.
The art flick fish flicker, right?
That's the fish. Yeah, totally the best. Yeah.
I'm gonna go off on a tangent for a second, right? So the idea is that we use AI to create a catapult that can identify when a warm water species is making its way upstream and it just gets thrown back down. Right?
This is not far off. There's already technology that's identifying fish by their spots. I think at this point it would not be a problem for them to say browns down and brook trout.
Yeah. Cool. I want to take a second too to because this is like this is a good teachable moment I see to talk about for people who are learning how all these interconnected systems act, right? Like that was not a put you on the spot question. That was like have we identified it all? What is the marker, right? And so this is the kind of like a moment to point out, right? Like all these things that potentially go into what impacts trout behavior, right? We've got the temperature of the water. We've got even we have sediment, we've got the habitat, we've got potential food sources, right? Maybe browns prefer to eat one bug and it doesn't exist, right? There are so many parameters that we look at, and we tend to be, as human beings, very myopic, right? We even break a lot of these components of fisheries management and streamside projects into, like, even my question before, well, what's the thing that gets it, right? Oh, it's connectivity, or is it like a lot of people will say like riparian buffer is really, from a fish perspective, should be the number one thing because it saves what you've got, right? Connectivity to me rings even more immediately about stormwater management than anything else, right?
It is. Yeah.
Right. Because at least that's where how the money comes in. When you say it's about stormwater management, it's easier to tie funds to getting the work done. And then when Trout Unlimited does these projects, and jump if I'm wrong, right? Then you bring in all those other things that we care about as anglers because we know they'll have positive impacts for the fishing, like dropping LWD, large woody debris, in where it's appropriate. Because and something I know is sort of on our list to talk about in a little while, right? Like that there's so many parameters that go into this. And to finish the point I was going to make, right? Like we are rarely engaged in acts that are looking at pictures fully, right? In how we're approaching a particular problem, right? We're usually band-aiding one thing. There's one thing that gets that, right? And that's one of the beauties of the angling community, I think, is that as conservationists and as naturalists and as people who have eyes on the river at all times, it's a lot easier for us to, I think, take in all of those components simultaneously and come up with an idea of what we think is going on. I think that's something that I think that I have a good ability of doing, is just I have enough knowledge and I spend enough time on the river and I have enough sensitivity and also enough restraint to not go knee jerk, right? Our whole reason for being here. Oh my God, the Esopus is so red. It's a turbidity problem and they caused it. It's like, no, let's take the time and look at everything and sort of figure it out and know what you know. That's a big phrase in my life right now. Like, what do you know, right?
What do you know? No inferences. Yeah.
Because don't get too distracted by these things. Might be happening in the immediate.
I totally agree. A lot of that resonates with me. And I think that something you said, which I'll just quickly touch on as to why maybe so much focus on the tributaries and the reconnection stuff. It does come down to stormwater management for the municipalities, towns. Many of them in the Catskills are townships with very small budgets. They only see people X amount of time in the year. The Esopus is a perfect case of it. The angler creel surveys show that, more than 50% of the anglers that visit the Esopus out of 8,000 in a year are not from Greene County. They're not from Ulster County. They're visiting. These are not folks who are there spending money in that town. So when it comes time to replace a pipe on a tributary that we think as anglers is not sufficient to get trout down through it, and we're worried about the stunted brook trout who's stuck in the pool, the city's got 10 grand. The project to be done right is 75. Yeah. The concept behind TU is that with funding like the Bond Act, national funding, New York State WQIP funding, NIFWIF funding. There are real dollars out there where we can walk into a township and say, the 3-foot pipe would cost you this much. We will cover everything to make it an ADM structure that's 7 times that size. Mm-hmm. Can we do the project? By doing so, it's a big win for the township. They trust us. They don't put a pipe in with a whole bunch of rocks around it that eventually blows out and makes a new jam. Mm-hmm. So I think that we establish trust by doing these types of projects and helping towns. We're an actual union to help them get to better work. Not saying, hey, every time the town of Shandaken does a pipe, they just put a ton of bluestone rock on top of a plastic pipe and they think it's done. That's the kind of solutions we can help fix. So again, that's why I think it's really important.
Right. I'm going to bring up a point to something that I experienced a couple months ago. And, I bit my tongue. It's not, I didn't call the person out at all, but it's also a matter of like, I want to say respect because it is about respect, but it's also about understanding that people's ideas about how these things get fixed, right? Like that, oh, just dredge it, no problem, right? Like these are all like it's old ways of thinking that worked, or we thought they worked, right? And it's never too late to say over and over again, like a lot of the work that we are doing is because the techniques that we used in the past, which we thought were sound, actually compounded problems for watershed management. And we have to undo that. And part of that is undoing thinking. And it's interesting. It was a culvert replacement project in my area here. And, because now we build things for the future, oversized culvert replacements so that we don't have to do them again with this idea of saving money long term. Mm-hmm. And you still get people that complain. Why are they putting this much effort, this much energy, this much money into a culvert replacement? It used to be this big. Does it really need to be the size of a tractor trailer now? And the one thing that's funny is yes, the answer is actually yes.
The answer is yes. Yep.
But it's indicative of this idea too, that what struck me about this person is that I got the sense that their position was that we were taking future jobs away. And it was very interesting, right? That like, look, contractors need to get hired every 5 years to fix things or whatever, right? And if you do it like this, like, well, of course, it's never going to be fixed.
Be out of work.
Then don't you understand that the world operates in this like consistent need to be fixing things? And I don't know that for sure. I may have been projecting, but that was sort of the sense that I got. And it's like, there's not really an argument against that. And especially, it's funny, Chet Karwatowski, who was the previous president of the Ashoka Packaging chapter, used to say this all the time. It's like, it's great. Sometimes it's great to know that you're right, to just know that you're doing it the right way. And so that's an culvert replacement is a big one. And pinch points just in general, right? Like some of the reasons, for people that know the area locally, like why was the bridge replacement project in Mount Tremper on Route 28 that was completed about 2 years ago, like why was that so massive, right? Is because previously you had 2 pinch points that were created. So the bridges were, rather than water going straight under the bridge, the abutments on either side were creating pinch points, and it's like a hose, right? That the bridges then become places that are going to siphon and shoot the water, make it even faster, right? Speeding velocity. And that's the reason, right? All these projects now are intentionally much larger to future-proof us, right?
We've got a lot to deal with on our tributaries. So I think opening them to a wider, safer standpoint is certainly a good strategy. Okay, I feel like I have to ask you this, and forgive me if this drives us outside of the rain, but I gotta do it. So turbidity, right? And I want to ask you this question, Todd. So the start of tonight's discussion was me hearing from other folks and myself looking at the river saying, it's running rich red. It's scary to me. I want to understand what it was like for you post Irene, looking at a river raging after a storm, conditions that are terrifying. Again, when we talk about the Red River right now, the things that were running through my mind when you and I first started talking, and the things that my friends were asking me about was, this is spawning season. There's tons of sediment coming down. that's going to fall right on top of eggs and choke out the eggs, right? That's what I read, is that the alevins won't survive because they're just covered in mud. Or there's all these concerns about what are the trout going to do. So I got to ask you, you've ridden through this before. You were there post Irene. Talk to me about somebody who's a new angler who's looking at Red River right now to the Esopus and said, I'm worried about trout next year.
Yeah. So there's the quick version is right. Like I saw turbidity that lasted for like 2 years, right? The river was, it was just so dark for so long. And I mentioned this to you briefly the other day. I didn't throw a dry fly on the Esopus for that first year after Irene, the following season, not once. Now, part of it was I was forcing myself to learn subsurface techniques because of the situation, right? But there was no, like, it wasn't like, usually the rules on the Esopus are, well, you fish subsurface, and if you see rising trout, you tie on a dry, right? And there were, the rising trout just didn't come. But the trout were there. The fishing was fantastic. Absolutely amazing. I caught tons of huge fish the first year after Irene, but I was going down to get them. The memory that I have that I'll never forget was the last day of the season. I fished the last day of the season that year. So we're talking, right, 2012. And I got up on a rock, a big rock, exposed rock in the middle of the river. And after I was done with fishing that day, it started to snow. And it was really this beautiful, cold fall day. And the snow is coming down. And I just got up on that rock and I lengthened out my leader a bit because I had been nymphing. I tied on a dry and not even casting at a spot on the river. I just spent like 10 minutes just trying to cast as long as possibly could, right? Just because I was like, oh, I really miss actually
It
casting.
feels so
And I
good.
just stood out in that. It was just it's such a beautiful memory, right? And also heartbreaking because I remember this is the first time that I tied a dry on for an entire season.
Mm.
Um, and it wasn't to even try to catch a trout. It was just for the beauty of the cast and because I missed it. And I was ready to hang up the gear for the season. This is obviously before we had 365. Um, so, uh, so yeah, it has in that case too, one important difference here is that we opened up a lot of clay banks then, right? It was not a point sourced turbidity situation like we have right now, right? In fact, if you go through the documentation and, Danny Davis talks about this too, right? That a lot when they're talking, the portal is not the primary, normally, the portal is not the primary source of turbidity on the Esopus. There's lots of natural sources. But this is a situation right now where it is the portal. And when that resolves, the turbidity should return to normal fairly quickly relative to Irene, right? That doesn't mean it's going to be fine tomorrow, but relative to Irene, this is going to move through sort of quickly. And we have some
Are
good.
there any advantages? Sorry, I cut you off thinking you were going to hold that. I was going to say, are there any advantages you'd say from a draining down perspective, from a what this means for next year? Maybe you can talk me through what might be the highlights of it.
Yeah. So and not that the concern about the sediment falling on eggs is real, which is true, right?
It's real, yeah.
But then there's like a funny irony to it, right? Because even in some of the emails that were getting bounced around, it's just like, I'm walking around and I don't see any reds, right? So what eggs are you talking about that you think are going to get covered, right? If it's a bad spawning year,
Mm-hmm.
what's really happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of an interesting thing. Here's what happens. Um, the biggest negative to me, and what's interesting here too, is that now that there are so many rainbow trout in the system, since the browns just keep getting hammered, so many of the last 5 years since we went wild, right? The browns get hammered. So the browns are at a great disadvantage. Not that they're dying, or it's not dire, right? But it's the fact that the browns spawning time is getting hit year after year after year, has some long-term effects. The presence of the reservoir, though, is the antidote to that in a way, right? the fish drop down. That's the answer to like a lot of these questions. Well, the fish just drop down. They go to the reservoir. It's been there for 100 years more, obviously, right? They're learning behavior. They're following the behavior of other fish that have been doing it, right? You have all this overlap, and they will find solace. They will find safety downstream. And that's what has been happening on the Esopus for a very, very long time. The concerns about fish populations on the Esopus are usually coinciding with large events like Irene, like previous storms. The immediate science, because we rely, in my opinion, too heavily on electroshocking, which I'm not a huge fan of, but that's
I know. Yeah, I know you don't love it. Yep.
that's my personal opinion. I think it's like smoking while you're pregnant, kind of a thing. We'll categorize it then. It's there at some point. But
Save that for another episode.
we'll save that for another episode. No, but I mean, people have heard me say this a lot, right? I think when you're trying to get an overall vision of stream health, as like the Rosgen system, and like you're trying to look at a little bit of everything, it's really great. But as a marker over time, where you say like, I'm going to go, poke the baby in the same exact spot at the same exact time, year after year. And if you think that animals aren't smart enough to start to learn your rhythms and just move out of a spot, I think that that's foolish. I think that's giving the species too little intelligence, right?
So really the data is only so complete, I guess, is really to your point, is that it's not really an affirmative survey. And so there's got to be other ways to try it, right? It's not really complete until, yeah.
It's also an Esopus thing, right? A lot of my opinions, and I said this at the beginning too, right? That the Esopus is a very unique fishery. It's extremely resilient. Things like letting rivers go wild, that's not a solution in all rivers. And it's really important that people recognize how beautifully unique the tailwaters of the Catskills are, all of them, right? These are not, it's one of the things I find it very ironic that the state uses the Esopus as a benchmark for any of its data that it uses across the state for how they manage streams. But the Esopus is still on, Esopus was one of the 9 fisheries used to establish the new protocols for trout management. It's continually used and observed for data that they're using. And there's so many variables on this extremely unique fishery that I don't think of the Esopus as particularly indicative of streams in general. It's too unique.
No, I don't think it is really. I think if anything, it's all of its own. It's not even comparable to some of the other Catskill systems in that way that have reservoirs. It runs totally different. So,
Right.
yeah, what makes it unique.
Yeah, back to your question about turbidity.
Yeah.
One of the biggest negative consequences that I believe about the turbidity is rainbow trout's feeding behavior, because rainbow trout are sight feeders. They really need to see it. They don't lash out the way that brown trout do or bass do at movement in the same way. They certainly get desperate when conditions are dire, but feeding is going to be off for trout in these conditions. Accumulations of turbidity in fish gills and stuff like that. Yes, it happens. It's a concern, but it's also still, I'm not trying to like turn a deaf ear so much as like we still don't have really any data that says turbidity is bad and has this specific physiological impact on the trout itself. There's just really not a lot there.
We need that data, or we need that science really to catch up.
It would be really great. But at the same time, it's like the naturalist in me says, okay, so like, let's look at Irene. We had far higher, far more sustained turbidity back then. And the initial science came out and said, oh, we've got rainbow trout collapse on the Esopus, and a big study was funded, and they did all the stuff, and they found out, oh my God, there's actually more rainbow trout on the Esopus than there were since the last time we did a study of this magnitude, right? So, and again, it's because of the pre-existing conditions that have here, slowly releasing headwaters, plenty of granular things that are filtering that water for water clarity, the artificial infusion of water that we get from the Schoharie, regardless of its turbidity, and then ultimately the artificial aspects of the reservoir itself, right? The fish are just going to drop down and spawn lower, spawn in the reservoir if they have to,
Mhm.
spawn on top of each other. They probably, I assume, like, we don't have a lot of information about specifically how trout spawn in Catskill environments.
Mhm.
But I assume that, like, those trout are going to start competing for the available space in that one big pool. That story that I
Mhm.
told earlier tonight. They'll find a way. And
Mhm.
if they don't find a way, the next generation will find a way. Um, but I also do believe that the reset time is about 9 years for every uh, um, handicapped spawning year, right?
Mm.
So, from the point of Irene, flash forward 9 years, and that's when the rainbow trout really started to rebound. It was like 9 years.
Mm.
I kind of liked it. It was an interesting graph I did, and I'll try and share it again about, like, when we talk about the impacts to spawning class. It's always 3 years out too, right? You don't see those impacts immediately. All right. If a spawning year gets compromised, um, those eggs disappear, but you don't really see that because you needed those eggs to age into spawning class. So the first thing is you have a handicapped spawning class 3 years out because they have a diminished number of trout that happen from the spawn getting hit by a storm or whatever it is, or in this case, it's drought. You know, um, so the other thing that does actually happen is that's equally as heartbreaking to me is that the site feeding birds will pull out when you have long sustained turbidity. So, which ironically is positive for the predation component of what happens, right? So the eagles move out and the osprey move out because they can't see anything. And then you have a lower amount of predation, right? Ospreys feed voraciously. And the only reason that the ospreys are here in the first place is because of Irene. The ospreys, I mean, you'd have to go back. I'm sure that's cyclical too, but I've been here just shy of 20 years, right? I didn't see a single osprey on the Esopus until Irene because the eagles moved out and the eagles disappeared for 2 years. And then the osprey are like, hey, there's no more eagles here. I guess we'll move in, right? And then the eagles follow the osprey back up, right? So it's really like this is the part of being like the monk on the mountain, right? Of being the guy out in that gets to live out here and live this life in the woods, where I'm like, the fish are going to be fine, but what about the eagles, right? They can't see the fish, they can't feed.
Mhm.
But again, I'm hoping that this is going to be more short term,
Yeah.
in the case of what's happening right now.
But that's good though. I feel like that gives the kind of overarching theme we were intending on upon this is that it's good that people care. It's good that we're all concerned. It's good that folks would even tap into a conversation just to learn more about a river. It's good that we care. Having stewards for a river is what we can do consistently, and that's obviously it's the bread and butter of what I'm hoping to achieve, in the Catskills across the board is just finding more and more folks who want to engage in conversations like this, want to learn about a system, want to understand, and when it is time to contact DEC and DEP to know what those parameters are. Say, okay, cool. Well, I am seeing something that's happening on this fishery that I think is unique, and I want to go to the right people. That's part of having an informed community, and I think that's hopefully what we would be a part of building here.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And really what it boils down to, and we've talked about this in many ways, shapes, and forms, is that, not fishing during the spawn is really like one of the most important things that you can do as an angler, right? And here's a perfect example, right? Like, hey, maybe in the beginning of the spawn, you went and you harvested, all your creel, maxed out your creel every day if you're a catch and keep type of person, right? And you pulled all those big spawners out and you're all excited, right? And then this happens a few weeks later, where all of a sudden we're down into the dregs. You're like, oh my God, what's going on? We know that whatever's left of that spawning class is going to have trouble, right? And you spent the early part of the spawning season fishing and harvesting, right? And now your heart's a little broken and you feel this more direct relationship to having potentially negatively impacted the fishery, right? I never people tell people to like not to fish. I encourage people to have the restraint to not fish, right? Sometimes you got to just scratch the itch. And lucky for us, most of us in the environment, people that are on the call here, like we're all catch and release anglers, and that's beautiful. And but it's an ideal, and it's not how everybody operates, But universally, we should not be fishing during the spawn. We just shouldn't, right? And the more that you step away, because this is not the first time that we've had this, right? I wrote the year because I made a note to myself about what year, 2016, we had massive drought on the Esopus. And we were writing letters, trying to get them to close the fishing season early, right? Very similar situation to what we had here before they really cranked the portal open. And it was abysmally low, just like what we saw this year. Okay. And we weren't getting anywhere. I started a change.org petition. And I tell the story that we got the river shut down in one day once I started that petition. After weeks, call the state, pressure them to sign the document. It's on the governor's desk, right? He's not signing the thing. I'm sure there was some just coincidence, right? It was like within minutes of Ed Van Putt signing the petition and making a comment about how nobody should be fishing this time of year anyway, right? We shouldn't be fishing the spawn. I got the call, the governor's signing it today, right?
Man.
And that was a big win for us.
That had to feel like a massive win. I mean, I think it's worth celebrating too. I think that's a big deal to realize that it can work, to take it through from red alert, we have to call, we have to do something, but also having the time to say, well, we need to organize the right form of action. It needs to be a well-documented letter with well-respected signatures. It's not just yelling or posting nasty comments on DEC's Instagram. That's not how these things work. So.
Yeah. Absolutely. It was a really big win, and it really it paved the way for things that happened, like getting the Esopus turned into a wild river, right? Flipping the state's position on what the Esopus should be, because that was like one of these, oh wow, the power of collective voice. I say it a lot when we're talking about the Esopus is Wild initiative, right? We stood up and we made our voices heard, and we turned the giant over. And we were able to protect the river. And it's not really like my style so much, but like on one case, I still saw people fishing after the river was closed, because there's a messaging concern there. It's really hard, right? But in one case, I did actually get out of my car. It's like, hey man, the river's really low and they actually closed fishing. Can you please step out of the river? Like I decided just once to feel it, because I'm not I don't browbeat people too much.
Same here. Yeah. I don't pretend to be an authority. I'm not. Yeah. But
it felt good, and he didn't look like a scary person, and he was really responsive to what I was just like, hey, I don't want to beat you up, but
the 365 season, obviously its own episode to talk about, I'm sure, in its own way. But again, I think this all comes down to its choice, right? Fishing during the spawn, fishing because it's legal, because you can, is just not where you want to be in terms of making conscious decisions. I think our ethics and our morals are what define us as individuals. We love this thing of chasing wild trout. The worst idea is to get selfish during the spawn, to need it right then and there in that moment. That's when it really crushes the beauty of spring. I think there's just so much about the seasonality of the classic angler season that's so special. And I still want to celebrate that. And it's probably why I'm still so latched on to the books from the 50s and 60s when it was a season. Every other wild game that's out there in New York to pursue has a season. We have respect for the animals. We give them their time to continue to procreate. And maybe it's just selfish that we want more fish in the river next year, that somebody like me doesn't fish during the spawn. But the thing is that it just makes sense. And we have a choice. Okay. The osprey looking for trout, he's got an empty belly. He doesn't have a choice. You and me just wanting a feel of the river again and wanting to cast a fly, you can still get that fulfillment without stomping over spawning fish, which again is just part of this. We have a choice as anglers to do better. I think we should.
Yeah. I want to move to a point that I know is in our notes, and we moved all over the place tonight, but
in a good way. It's fun.
Because the other concern about this situation here, we just talked about turbidity, and I'll say too, another thing, just like observationally, right? The location of turbidity is a big deal, right? If you have turbidity low in the system, it doesn't impact the system as much, right? But one thing lets go up in the headwaters, the whole river's going to be blown out, right? And those are
Mhm.
the things we want to avoid. And so like tempering, one thing that I noticed this year, going back to the same place again for the red survey, uh, um, what seems to be like a pretty massive clay bank that's exposed up there that wasn't there last year because we walked through it and did all of this last year. And having a large newly exposed clay bank up in the headwaters means, potentially like ruined days on the river. But again, these are actually in some ways the things that the state is even more keyed in on, and the city, obviously, potentially places to intervene to pull that turbidity out. Um, but the other thing that we didn't talk about as much, and there's some points there, is the impacts of the drought leading into the more sustained releases that we have coming out of the Schoharie right now. And I told you I went back and looked up. I did some studies about did some studies. I did some reading of studies about macroinvertebrates and the insects. And what was really interesting in a lot of the studies of like when they're looking at survival rates for macroinvertebrates in drought conditions, that again, similar to what I said before, looking at all these different parameters, uh, uh, to study about the behavior of the insects, and they know that something happens, but they're still not sure why it happens, right? But they're studying all these things and say, oh, okay, so insects of this size behave like this, and insects of this size behave like this, but we don't really sure what it is that is triggering that moment that their behavior changes into what they call basically like, I'm forgetting the term, but like something triggers, the insect knows it's a dire moment and they have to compensate. So the crawlers crawl, they try and stay wet. The increased feeding happens is one of the things that they notice, right? But then ultimately to this idea that came to me, which is like, we say it all the time. Oh, macroinvertebrates are as old as the dinosaurs. So I looked it up, right? And macroinvertebrates are literally about 4 to 500 million years old, right?
Nuts.
Put that in perspective, trout are 15 to 20 million years old, and Homo sapiens are only 200,000 years old, right? Which is to say that, because that's another really absolutely valid point. In extreme drought conditions, macroinvertebrates are going to suffer big time,
Yep,
right? Because they're just going
no
to,
doubt.
right? They're not all crawlers. They're not able to
Nope.
maintain.
Many of them are buried under rocks. They're not moving. Yeah,
Some of them do
big
go
time.
deep. So the burrowers can actually go deep and stay safe a little bit longer. So that's important to know too, right? Something that's on the edge, right? Because everybody's getting compromised as that river is
Hmm.
narrowing and narrowing. So if all they need to do is get down a little bit and still a little bit wet, right? You have survival rate. Um,
Yeah,
but the point that I think I really want to make here is that, and especially in reading in these studies, that not knowing what it is that's triggering the survival mechanisms in the insects is that these insects have had hundreds of millions of years to develop tactics for surviving extreme conditions that they've experienced time and time and time and time again. And we only know trout and we only know macroinvertebrates and we only know climate in this narrow period of time that we've been studying it, right? So all of the natural processes, all of the ecosystems have a life that they to themselves. And they've got tactics we've never even been witness to survive these types of events. And that's
yeah,
another reason why
yeah.
the trout are going to be just fine, right?
They got millions of years of being just fine after hard seasons. Yeah,
And we talked about this the other day, right? It doesn't matter where you go and fish for trout in the world. We are still bound by the rules that we know about the animal. They don't like motion over their heads, right? They are programmed to avoid avian predation no matter where they are. And it doesn't even matter if there's not a single surface piercing bird in the environment where that particular trout lives in whatever river somewhere else, right?
they still move like they are.
It
Yeah,
makes right. but they still act as if they're going to get eaten by birds that aren't
Yeah.
even there, right? That's genetic programming that's existed for, what was it, like tens of millions of years in them, and it's never going to go away. And that means that there are survival mechanisms that have gone through periods of extreme drought, extreme high water, cold temperatures, warm temperatures, right? Tens of millions of years that they've been able to develop skills to survive situations like this. When you have a fishery like the Esopus that has natural antidotes to the effects of global warming. And that's another important qualifier as well, right? Those
Yeah.
techniques don't serve, that doesn't make a trout survive water that they simply can't breathe in because that river can no longer sustain low temps, period, right?
Mhm.
That's not what I'm talking about. We're talking about Esopus trout, and we're talking about a trout fishery that will, it is a perfect nursery. So even if it takes 9 years for the rebound, it's always going to happen, right? And we have 3 trout species here too, right? Which is ultimately going to help the entire fishery, right? That
Yep.
the browns and the rainbows are going to ebb and flow in the way that they keep themselves alive. And the longer
Mhm.
that we don't stock this river, we know that that line of the wild brookies coming is they're making their way downstream. You know,
Mhm.
I was really proud to post that post earlier this year about catching just a normal old, not huge, but a normal old brook trout, wild brook and rainbow and brown within a matter of 10 minutes, you know, in a spot pretty far down on the Esopus. This was not a little guy that got washed down, especially not during a
Mhm.
drought. So
He lives there. Yeah.
yeah,
Man,
yeah,
that's awesome.
yeah.
It's so cool. I also had some amazing experiences on the river this year and found that fishing into the, like, even into late September, early October was just fantastic on the river. It was a different river than I fished it every other time, which is part of the appeal of going back. Obviously, there was dodging turbidity a lot in the summer and moving up to small water, but yeah, it's the Esopus to me is truly like the optimist angler's paradise in so many ways. Like how dry or die I am in so many contexts. I just love the traditional components of fishing a dry fly. So I love fishing the Esopus for a lot of reasons. And I always tell people it's a great place to practice your dry fly game for a lot of reasons. But the ability to fish a dry fly on fast water to rainbow trout that are feeding, nose up in fast water of all size classes can happen all over the Esopus. It's unlike a lot of other rivers where you can just absolutely tease and entice a trout whose nose is in the top of the riffle. He's not rising to eat bugs. There's no mayflies coming down, but a really tantalizing drift puts a fish in the net. That's something that happens on the Esopus all the time. This year, I got to do it with friends who, a buddy of mine who has never caught a trout on a dry fly, never caught a wild rainbow in the Esopus, and fished it every year for the last several years. This year, it was so fun to fish even a sporadic caddis hatch and get people catching trout on dry flies on the Esopus. So for what it may seem, I think it's about the angler that goes there season in, season out, not knowing for sure if it's going to be perfect conditions for what they remember it last June, but it's the angler that goes there in spite of not knowing that I think makes it really special. It's one of the reasons why I always celebrate it. And I go out there and I fish the dry fly in really unsuspecting circumstances and I catch fat trout doing it. I love doing it, and I love pushing people onto that game because it's fun, and it's got such rich history. I love swinging wet flies. My buddy Bobby fished the Sopus with me this year, Bob Wilner, and he totally is one of those guys that has adapted to the old school method that Esopus anglers like Ray Smith and others really made the Esopus famous for: swinging wet flies in those fast riffles and currents of the Esopus. You can run into so many fish subsurface that are just willing to eat a small wet fly, soft hackles swinging. So yeah, the Esopus is such a crazy fishery, man. I think it makes me excited. And I can't see myself out wandering around trying to fish it right now in all the troubles it's in. Just like I can't go fish the West Branch for the same reasons. I don't want to be out there and potentially causing trouble. But I can spend all the rest of this winter just excited about my return back there. So, this conversation has certainly helped spark some of that too. I can't wait to get back out there when it's right.
I'm a big fan. Yeah, the term river gazing is a term I use
Mm.
in winter, and I think it's really important to go and visit rivers and spend the contemplative time, right? For all the
Oh, I
tri
like that.
for all the trips that you go out and you're done at the end of the day and you're like, oh my God, I didn't stop for a single second, right? We've all done that.
Hmm.
We've all had those days.
Hmm.
Where, wow, I didn't even stop to admire. I just fished. I was so,
Yep.
you know, I think river gazing is a form of worship of this thing that we love. And
That's cool. I
it's
like that.
I think it's really important to go to the river without a rod. Engage with the red survey is so it's so beautifully liberating to go put your waders on and go through the whole process and not even have a rod in your hand.
Mm.
It's really interesting change to the dance, to the costuming, to the act of being in the river. And it makes you feel really good. And I think that act of river gazing is an important component of being a well-rounded angler.
I
And
love that.
it's the end of, it's the end of the complete angler too. If you remember when you read it, because you probably read it when you first started, or if you haven't, go visit it, right? But Walton was a priest, and he states that somewhere near the end of that book that the goal of the angler is to eventually be able to visit the river and receive the same beautiful gifts as you normally do when a trout is attached to the end of your rod. That's the goal, right? So these moments that we spend in worship of it in the off season are important. They're important to our mental health and to having a holistic relationship with the river. Um,
I love that.
Thanks. And I want to backtrack. I'm going to put you on the spot for a second.
Please.
Please tell a story. I know you brought your father to fish
Hmm.
the Esopus when in that sort of that great spot, right? Like when it started to cool down. I
Hmm.
guess it's probably about September.
Yep.
Can you share with us a little story, a bit of that day?
Yeah. Yeah. I've struggled, with the loss of my mom due to cancer a few years ago. I've struggled to get my dad back out to places that we used to fish together. And the Esopus is the first place that I remember it was my turn to help teach my mom to cast a fly rod because my dad felt it wasn't delicate or gentle enough to do it. So fishing on the Esopus with my mom was a really special gift because it was when my mom was in remission. She was really not totally well healthy wise, but wanted to have a day on the river with the boys. So, it was really hard for my dad to even consider going back out to the Esopus to fish because he just was tied into a very specific memory the last time we were there. And this year, instead of him being home around their anniversary, my nephew and I decided to go and take him out for a weekend in the Catskills. And it was, it's the kind of thing I'll always remember is that I was simultaneously in between my father, who taught me to chase trout in the first place. I wouldn't care about them if it wasn't for him. And my nephew, who is, the closest thing I have to a next generation, I have to teach this thing to, this special bond between my father and me and his grandfather and him. The Esopus is the place where all that happened, and to be able to bring the boys out and spend some time on the river and truly have to do the work. There was dark water coming out of the portal. We had to get creative. We had to pull out maps and start looking at small water. And I'm saying, oh, I know there's a big flat recess way up on this hill. So I know there's water between those two marker points on this road. There has to be. So we can go up there and I'll show you how to catch a brook trout. So I got that experience to be with my dad, being a really good steward of the river, saying, no, we can't go fish down there. It's too warm. We can't go fish over there. It's going to be hard, but we can go fish over here. And so this year, I think, was really special for me to be able to kind of put that ownership on myself to say, I want to be a part of not only showing my father how much this resource means to me, but also to pass it on to the next generation. And so this year on the Esopus, I felt like I was helping pay back something that's been so special to me and truly helped to lift my dad through a really hard time. So, I'm indebted to the Esopus, and it'll always be this way. I'll always go there. And I hope every October I can take my dad for as long as I can, and we can have similar memories. But it was a totally special year for me. Yeah.
Nice. Well, you and I met on the Esopus and started this amazing small world, good friendship
Totally.
together. So yeah, it's making memories and reconnecting people with memories. And I'm really glad I asked you that story. The components of
That's
it.
it.
I didn't
That's
really.
that's the truth of it. And Yeah. Okay. I'll freeform you because I want to I really have to make a mention of this. I feel like something you said specifically about river gazing matters. I told you I was going to give you 3 of 3s, right? I had books, records, and flies. I'm not going to too much time, but can I give you 3 books?
Yeah, go,
Okay.
go.
All right. This is A Philosophy of Walking, Frederick Gross. Incredible book. Truly, I think so much of what I've learned about time on the river, with or without my fly rod, and what mattered to me was driven by a lot of the writing in this book. I totally recommend it. It's fantastic. It adds, and it sits on the shelf with only angling books, even though there's not a mention of fly fishing in it. It's totally fantastic. You should read it. A lot of what I learned about the Esopus too. I have to give credit, Ed Stopcheck. You held this copy of this book for me. Wandering Mountain Fly Fisher. Got to plug Ed. We have to love our living writers. That's, I think, a huge loss in so many ways. We've lost a lot, but we talked a lot about Ed Van Putt. Obviously, Ed Van Putt, got to pick up Trout Fishing in the Catskills, got to get Beaver Kill, but also his book on James Beecher is fantastic. And as all of his books are, many times he's talking about flies and fly fishing and trout, but the history of the Catskills is in Ed's books in a way that's not in other writers' books. So I think, in addition to just, this should be a rite of passage for everybody that fishes the rivers and the cat, you should own this and you should own this. You got to own these. You can't do the Catskills without these two. But yeah, so that's those are just a couple of book plugs. Oh, and one more thing I have to show you, because you will totally geek out on this. I wanted a copy of this Joseph Bates book. Do you have this? Atlantic Salmon, Flies, and Fishing? Do you have this book?
No, I don't really have salmon fishing books.
It's the weak part of my library. Really wanted to own it. I have a couple books on streamers from Bates because I wanted to tie the old hair wing style streamers.
Mm-hmm.
I was looking for this book. I found it on eBay and I bought it, not because I got this copy, but because this is the sticker on the inside of the book.
Wow.
This is a library stamp sticker that Harry Darby and Elsie Darby kept
Darby, right?
All the books. Yeah, all the books in their collection were stamped with this sticker, which I'm doing a terrible job putting it on the camera. But that's the sticker. That's the library mark. And I got the book for $15 on eBay because that was a photo I could barely see inside the book. So yeah, watch eBay. Go look for cool books.
Very
super dense Catskill history.
Very, very cool. This has been really amazing. What a pleasure to talk with you tonight. We were going to talk a little bit about like fishing next year. But we've gone for a while. I think we've done some good damage here. I think, the season will be what it's going to be. And, I think, one of the points that were sort of like in our notes about fishing, the quality of fishing at any given moment is based entirely on the angler's skill, right? The state of the fishery is based largely on what your own personal skill is, right? So, which is to say, don't be discouraged if you don't catch fish next year, right? It might be hard if there's still turbidity around. But we know that the Esopus has come back time and time again. So, it's the off season. It's time to study, learn as much as you can, tie flies, watch videos, hit up guys like us for more knowledge and what have you. And go river gaze. Yeah, it's a really important part.
Go take a look. Go watch the river. Yeah.
What's coming up next? I think you have anything to plug?
Yeah, a couple things. Okay, cool. I gotta make this post. It's gotta happen. Wesco Brewing Brookie, you all know the beer. If you drink beers in the Catskills, you know it. But starting this year, all cans, if you buy this beer in your package store, 2% of all can sales go directly to TU Brook Trout Habitat Projects. It's a program we're calling Brookies for Brookies. So if you see Wesco Brewing at your local store, if you want to ask a craft distributor, you can get it. And 2% of that work, again, is for brook trout habitat improvement in New York.
That's statewide. That's the beer, no matter where you buy it.
Wholesale, or at any of the Westkill brewery or at the supply shop. So every time you buy the can, that's format.
Amazing. I totally misread that. I thought that was an event thing, a specific event, a give back event.
Nope. next
That's
week, this
incredible.
can label will change. There'll be a TU QR code right in
Oh,
here that takes you over to the link. And yeah, so
so
2% of
beautiful.
all the can sales all the time. Big shout out to Mike at Westkill for wanting to do it. I think it's amazing. And then obviously, if I made one more last plug, it's that in the heart of the Catskills, you've got the Catskill Mountain TU chapter, been around for 60 plus years, the Ashokan chapter, Mid Hudson chapter, Upper Delaware. There's a lot of groups, folks that want to get involved in helping take care of the rivers. If that's something that interests you and you don't know where to go, I'm the guy to ask. So, yeah.
Well, thanks again, Jesse. I'll make one
Thanks,
little
Todd.
plug. I reopened the online store. There's lots of
Good.
stuff there, including Etta Chuck's book, and everything on the store, including clearance items, like rods that are already 20-30% off. Mighty 20, you'll see it on the website, an additional 20% off everything on the website. So if you want to help guys like me out putting this information, go buy something. It would be really great. Thanks again to everybody. Thanks for joining us online. Thanks so much to Jesse Vadala of Trout Unlimited for spending time with us and rounding out my opinions about the state of the Esopus as a fishery and as a creek. Thanks to everybody. Words Over Water will officially be its own entity now. So look out, follow us as all that stuff comes online. And I will follow up with people. I'll post some relevant links to things that Jesse and I discussed back on the blog page where you found the link to tonight's event. And additionally, if you want, just sign up for the newsletter at esopuscreel.com and you'll get some follow-up information on tonight's event. Have a wonderful holiday season. Stay safe and warm. And as we always say, tight lines.